Welcome, fellow researchers. It is truly an honor to be here presenting my work at the Third International Material Research Congress. Before anything else, I would like to thank the National Autonomous University of Mexico and the Metropolitan Autonomous University for allowing me to develop this research that I hope you'll find as interesting as I do.
My name is Francisco Padilla. I am a master's student in biochemical sciences, and my co-authors make up the tutoring committee of my research, being Dr. Magdalena Guerra Crespo, the main tutor. If among the many posters this one caught your attention, it is undoubtedly because of its appealing title, Stabilization of Basal Dopamine for Controlled Drug Delivery in Parkinson's Disease. Well, it is indeed a disruptive topic, both because of the disease and the approach we propose. Therefore, throughout this video, I'm going to describe what the work is about and what we have achieved so far, so that if you're interested, you could help us continue the research and take it to its ultimate reaches. Well, to begin with, I will quickly give an overview of the background in which this work arises. So we all heard of Parkinson's disease, especially its motor symptoms, although there are also others associated with cognitive problems. And well, in short, all the symptomatology it's due to the depletion of basal levels of dopamine, the neurotransmitter responsible for regulating, among other things, motor activity. Dopamine being such an important molecule in this regard, several attempts have been made over the years to restore its loss in Parkinson's disease by means of different techniques seeking to attenuate symptoms and slow disease progression. These approaches have been based on the use of precursors or agonists, since dopamine per se is highly reactive and unstable, and its oxidized subproducts are not only useless, but in fact can become toxic to the organism. However, since dopamine is what the patient needs, a more physiological approach would be to administer the neurotransmitter directly, thus avoiding the side effects associated with other treatments. In this sense, a mechanism is needed to administer dopamine, keeping it in its basal state. Recent approaches have opted for the use of nanoreservoirs, that is to say, nanostructures capable of stabilizing drugs and releasing them in a controlled manner. In our case, we will be using a material with excellent properties, silicon dioxide, whose mesopore structure has been key in the controlled release of drugs. Therefore, the objectives of this research so far are threefold: to synthesize dopamine-containing nanoreservoirs, to characterize the physicochemical properties, especially the state of the stabilized dopamine, and to evaluate the release kinetics in order to obtain models that describe it. Thus, the methods are also divided into three. First, for the synthesis of the nanoreservoirs, the Solid method was followed, which allows manipulation of the synthesis parameters to adjust the physicochemical properties of the nanoparticles obtained. This diagram describes in a simple way the synthesis reactor used to obtain the nanoreservoirs, which allow preserving dopamine in its basal state during the whole synthesis process. With this, 5 samples of nanoreservoirs were obtained. The first is the pure silicon dioxide matrix, which was used as a reference. Next, 3 samples were obtained with different concentrations of basal dopamine, 5, 10, and 15 ml%. And finally, we obtained a sample in which dopamine was intentionally oxidized to compare its effects against the nanoreservoirs with dopamine in its basal state. This was important since the basal state is what we are looking for, as we described before. So, with that in mind, let me tell you that all the nanoreservoirs obtained were characterized by 13 different techniques to determine their physicochemical properties. First, scanning and transmission electron microscopies allow us to know the size of nanoparticles, their topology, and morphology. Next, we evaluated their chemical composition. X-ray photoemission and energy dispersive spectroscopies showed the atomic stoichiometry and electronic structure, and further transformed infrared and ultraviolet visible spectroscopies showed the functional groups and, very importantly, the state of the stabilized dopamine, which is of utmost importance as mentioned above. Next, the physical properties were evaluated. Firstly, the interaction of dopamine with the silicon dioxide matrix was evaluated by nuclear magnetic resonance. The surface properties, such as charge, area, and bore size, were studied by electrophoretic light scattering and the absorption-desorption of nitrogen. Subsequently, the structure of the nanoreservoir was observed by X-ray diffraction. Thermogravimetric analysis and differential scanning calorimetry showed the thermal stability, and finally, the presence of acid sites was evaluated by pyridine absorption. At last, once the characterization was done, it was necessary to evaluate the release kinetics of the stabilized dopamine, a parameter that is directly related to the physicochemical properties of the nanoreservoirs. For this purpose, the nanoreservoirs were placed in distilled water and evaluated by calorimetry for 100 hours to observe the release rate. With above, the following results were obtained. As mentioned above, each technique described a characteristic of the nanoreservoirs. A more detailed explanation can be found in the figures attached to this poster. However, here I will quickly describe the most important. As we can see in the photograph of the synthesis, sample A, which corresponds to the silicon dioxide matrix without dopamine, exhibits a characteristic white color, which is also observed for samples B, C, and D. That is to say, the samples synthesized with dopamine in its basal state. In contrast, sample E, containing oxidized dopamine, exhibits a brownish coloration. This visual assessment serves as a first corroboration of the state of dopamine in the nanoreservoirs. However, this needed to be corroborated by the rest of the techniques. Well, there are so many different techniques here, but for the sake of simplicity, I will proceed to describe the conclusions we draw from all these techniques, which serve to build what is the most important part, that is an atomic model of their structure, which is shown here. Nanoreservoirs are nanoparticles with individual sizes between 7 and 50 nanometers, that is within the nanoscale, with the ability to agglomerate into compounds smaller than 100 nanometers. Nanoreservoirs are composed of an amorphous silicon dioxide matrix with high presence of hydroxyl groups, silanols, point defects, and a negative surface charge and a high concentration of Lewis-type acid sites in the matrix, in which dopamine is stabilized by the presence of the charges at the molecular junctions. And the presence of mesopores of around 4 nanometers results in high surface areas of about 500 square meters per gram, which translates into the ability to stabilize large drug concentrations. At least right now we have 15%. In the nanoreservoirs, dopamine is stabilized in its basal state by weak interactions within the surface hydroxyl groups through hydrogen bonds. No oxidized derivatives were observed, and notably, during the synthesis process, the concentration and oxidative state of dopamine determines the type of electronic structure that the elements composing the nanoreservoirs will take, making the basal state nanoreservoirs structurally different from the ones with oxidized dopamine. Regarding stability, until today, nanoreservoirs have been able to preserve dopamine in its basal state for almost a year, and the nanoreservoirs are stable up to 130 Celsius degrees, which makes them ideal for incorporation into organisms with body temperatures of around 36-37 degrees Celsius. This is important to know since dopamine release is governed by these properties. Thus, when evaluating the release kinetics, we were able to observe that the model that best described it was Scores-Meyer-Peppas model, which describes the release in polymeric systems. as in the case of amorphous silicon dioxide. As you can see here, the value of n of the Korsmeyer-Pepes equation for our nanoreservoirs was less than 0.5 for all samples, indicating that kinetics are governed by diffusivity, particularly a Fick diffusion. This indicates that the release rate can be easily manipulated by regulation in the pore size of the silicon dioxide matrix during the synthesis process. While the above does not necessarily describe what will occur in vivo models, it does provide a more complete picture of the factors affecting release, which will allow us to adjust them according to the patient need. With all of the above, research so far has shown that nanoreservoirs consist of a fine white powder when dopamine is stabilized in its basal state and a brown powder when it is oxidized. Dopamine is stabilized on the surface and mesopores of silicon dioxide due to the acid sites and their negative charges, and finally, dopamine is released in a controlled manner following the Korsmeyer-Pepes model. With the above, we can proceed with the next stage of the project, which will consist of the evaluation of the biocompatibility of the nanoreservoirs with dopaminergic neurons, and in addition, to study the mechanisms and rate of internalization of dopamine in neurons, so that we can adjust doses and release kinetics. It is hoped that eventually the nanoreservoirs can become a new mechanism for the restitution of physiological levels of dopamine in patients with Parkinson's disease, once their effect on the organism is known and they have been made more efficient to allow non-invasive administration in patients. With the above, I conclude the presentation of my poster. I would just like to thank Dagapa Papit, the CONACYT, and the biologist Marcela Palomero Rivero.
Well, with that, I'll finish my presentation. I remain at your complete disposal for any questions you may have about the status of the research, or if you want to participate in some kind of way, I'll be glad to receive your emails. My email is in the poster, so if you want to contact me or something, I'm free to do it. So thank you very much for allowing me to be here presenting my work. I hope you found it interesting, and I'll be glad to answer any questions you have.